to the war in Ukraine now, where both Ukraine and Russia are claiming to have made new advances in the Kursk region. These pictures here, released by a Ukrainian military unit, claim to show the start of the incursion into Russia. Kyiv says it has taken control of Sudzha, the largest Russian town to fall to Ukraine since the cross-border operation began. Moscow says it has recaptured one village in Kursk and that it would send additional forces to the neighbouring Belgorod region. A Kremlin aide told state media that Ukraine would not have attacked Russian territory without direct support from the West. Now let's bring in Frank Lebwich. He's a former British military intelligence officer and a senior lecturer in war studies at Portsmouth University. Frank, is it just the element of surprise that has left Russian forces struggling with Ukraine's advance, or are there other reasons?
Good afternoon, Gerhard. The element of surprise is really important. We have to remember that we're only a week into this operation, and were the Russians to be planning a counterattack, we're looking at probably a month or so before they'll be able to put together a force, if they haven't one ready properly, to counterattack. There's another option too, and that is that Russia is content, maybe despite the optics, content to leave the Ukrainians to roam around in that area and provide just a holding force. It's unlikely that Ukraine will be able to push much further by orders of magnitude, another 10, 20, 30 kilometres, simply because of logistics. And you're going to get to a situation, I think, whereby this may become as much of a burden for the Ukrainians as it is on the Russians. The key thing, though, is optics. It's the political aspect. Right now, that looks good for Ukraine. But over the next few weeks, it may well be that perception will shift as neither side makes gains. But the Ukrainians have deployed rather large assets and have to rotate them in and out. So anyway, to come back to your question, it takes time to do these things.
Talking about the assets that are being deployed, the most capable Russian units are fighting in eastern Ukraine. Do you think Russia will take the bait to deploy those troops to its own territory?
Well, that's a great phrase, take the bait. And I think that the way the Russians are looking at it is bait, and we're not going to take it, particularly against the background that Russian advances have been, and this hasn't been well circulated, have been increasing in tempo and momentum over the last few weeks in the south towards the town of Pokrovsk. The Russians, and I think any sensible military commentator or analyst, would see that as a more important front. I don't see the Russians removing troops from that. The Ukrainians already have, which may account for the increase in tempo of Russian operations. However, I think it would be foolish for the Russians to move troops from that or any other major combat sector, but they've done foolish things in the past. And they do see the bait dangling there. I don't think they'll take it. I think they'll allow the Ukrainians to soak up more of their best units up there in Kursk, holding what they've got. Perhaps the best thing for the Ukrainians over the next few weeks is to take the win and withdraw quickly, which would also look to me an intelligent move. But who am I to make comments like that?
Now, so you don't think they will try and hold on to it as a bargaining chip?
Oh, really? I think that's the most likely course of action they will take, since they've hinted as much, and I think the Russians expect that too. But if they do that, and what they're doing, they're going to have to hold that, and they're going to have to use the 5 or 6 brigades and rotation elements to hold that ground against Russian counterattacks, bearing in mind, of course, the Russians can afford the manpower and equipment issues more than the Ukrainians. But I think it is likely they'll hold on to it. What I'm suggesting is there are other course of actions that may be options. At the moment, it's looking good for them, but let's see 2 months down the line, looking at the whole theatre of operations, where we are.
The military expert Frank Lebwich there. As ever, thank you.
Thank you, Gerhard.
Let's bring in Marina Miron here from the War Studies Department at King's College London. Marina, Russia has not managed to stop Ukraine's advance into its territory. Why is that, given the military superiority of Russia?
Well, there are several reasons for that. The first option is, and of course, Ukraine knew when they started this Kursk offensive, it was a surprise for the Russians. And in order to send in troops, it takes time, and you have to decide where you get those troops from. That is perhaps why the Russians declared this to be a counter-terrorism operation, so that they could use bodyguards, they could use the FSB, but there are also Marine infantry fighting in the region. Some ex-Wagner fighters are fighting in the region in order not to get troops from Ukraine. Or at least from strategically important directions. The second reason could be is that the Russians are waiting for the Ukrainian forces to get in deeper, to expose their logistics, in order then to launch a counterattack. So we don't know which of these are true. Maybe it's a combination of all, but it looks like the situation remains tense. However, the Ukrainian forces still have not managed to take Korenivo or Rilsk, which would give Ukraine an important advantage.
How is Ukraine benefiting from this offensive into Russia? Is it alleviating pressure on Ukraine's troops elsewhere?
Well, I think the main benefits are coming in the informational space, where Ukraine is demonstrating that it can launch an incursion on the Russian territory. However, if you look at the battlefield and reports from Ukrainian units, such as the 21st Battalion near Krasnohorivka, which is south of Avdiivka, they are stating that they don't have enough people, and the situation has already been tense for them, but now it's much more difficult since Ukrainian units were deployed to Kursk, so they don't have enough artillery shells. Their drones are not as effective against Russian electronic warfare systems, and so they are facing a lot of difficulties, specifically around Toretsk, around Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, to a certain extent, Chasiv Yar. So it doesn't seem like the pressure has been alleviated, quite the opposite.
Now, Russia says it's recaptured a village in the Kursk region and will send additional forces to neighboring Belgorod. Does it really have enough troops? Does Russia really have enough troops? Does troop deployment for Russia mean pulling some of its forces out of Ukraine?
There have been reports that Russia has pulled some troops from Zaporizhia because the front line is somewhat stable there, but they are not going to pull troops from the likes of Pokrovsk or Toretsk. And the problem is, it's a very complex logistical operation to get the troops from Ukraine to the Kursk region, and you're risking Ukrainian attacks on the logistical lines. Therefore, that is not an ideal scenario, and that's what Ukraine is waiting for, to, as I said, to alleviate the pressure. But there are volunteers who are fighting from South Ossetia, from Abkhazia, which is a breakaway region in Georgia. There are also conscripts being sent to fight in Kursk. The question here is what the aims are: to draw the Ukrainian forces in or to get them out of Kursk as soon as possible. And it also depends on what the Ukrainian contingent is and how many reserves Ukraine has and is willing to send. So it's difficult to estimate a number of forces needed here.
Now, the leader of Belarus, which is an ally of Russia, has called for peace between Russia and Ukraine. What do you make of that?
Well, actually, if we look at Alexander Lukashenko's statements throughout the past years, he called for peace negotiations maybe 3 or 4 times at least, last time being in April of this year. Therefore, I think that he's afraid of a potential escalation. And so he's trying to play into this narrative that NATO is benefiting from Ukraine and Russia fighting against each other and killing each other, which certainly benefits the Kremlin. And his stance generally is more political in nature. Now, Belarus was claiming that it was a Ukrainian drone flying over its territory, which hasn't been confirmed. It moved its troops to the Ukrainian border, possibly fearing that Ukraine might launch an incursion into Belarus. So for Lukashenko, of course, knowing that Russia will need to respond politically to this incursion in Kursk, he's probably fearing being implicated.
Okay. Marina, thank you very much. That was military analyst Marina Miron.